Hello and welcome to Cascade Community Foundation's Q&A live stream series. I'm Deanna Falzone from Fox 17 Morning News. Over the past month, I've been welcomed inside a critical story that is far too often untold. A conversation about mental illness and its impact on residents in the surrounding communities of Grand Rapids. Tonight, we take this very important conversation through the aging population of local senior citizens who for over a year now have been isolated inside the place they only recently began to call home, a senior living community. As part of Cascade Community Foundation's months-long investigation to better understand mental health and how it has affected you, we were given exclusive access to a small area at Cascade Trails Senior Living. 3 interviews, each offering incredible insight into the mental health implications of the year-long quarantine period that has presented unthinkable challenges from staff and caretakers and unimaginable patience from a population of people with everything to offer except time. But first, our guests. I want to welcome Dr. Robert Riley, board-certified internal medicine at Metro Health, University of Michigan Health. He attended medical school in Ann Arbor and completed his residency at the University of Colorado, and has been practicing medicine for 26 years now with a number of specialties, including mental health and anxiety and depression. And I want to start with you, just kind of a broad view, and obviously we'll dive into it more here, but kind of give our viewers an idea of what you've seen over the past year when it comes to your elderly patients during this pandemic.
Well, I think my expectation is that they would probably have a lot more anxiety, possibly more depression, due to things like social isolation, and they've actually done really well. They've been really resilient, have managed to turn from coming to see people and doctors in person to doing things more remotely and handling new technology, though there's certainly been a lot of anxiety over this last year.
Yeah, it's definitely been eye-opening, but at the same time, I think throughout this, people's perception might change a little bit at how they've been able to handle this and give them some insight and really what they're capable of. And it might be surprising for some people. So I'm also joined by Nancy Ayers, licensed master social worker in the state of Michigan. You have degrees from Monmouth College and Eastern Illinois University. And for the past 10 years, you've worked with seniors in skilled nursing and assisted living environments, and then you currently supervise case managers and outreach and assistance of elderly clients at Senior Meighbors. So we appreciate your time and expertise as well. So I want to ask you that same question from your perspective. Were you surprised too to see over this past year how they've handled this?
Actually, yes. I think that, as Dr. Riley mentioned, the resilience is definitely there. I think that any differences might be person-specific and not so much globally to a population of seniors. It's been very much individualized. But in general, yes, I have been surprised.
I think because over this past year, right, we've seen the headlines and the images and the videos plastered all over of, kids standing at the nursing home windows and things like that. And that's obviously very real. And those are things that have been really hard for people. But to kind of take this look now inside and kind of pull that back and see that through all of that, they've had this resiliency, we can all learn from that a little bit, I think. So first, let's just, for people to kind of get a little bit of an idea, I guess in simple terms, kind of put into perspective how our brains work as we age and the changes that happen that way.
Well, as we age, our brain volumes shrink. They become smaller, and that can affect many things. It can affect memory, it can affect our ability to learn new tasks and be able to adapt to them as well. Also, with chronic medical diseases, there can be things like hypertension or diabetes that can increase the risk of small mini strokes that wouldn't be detectable but can overall impact our ability to function. And this is the reason sometimes reaction times are slower in people as they get older and memory issues become more prominent, and this can affect mental health as well.
So you've probably seen more in those situations where it's been a little harder to adapt or adjust so quickly?
exactly.
for them?
I think that, again, as a group, the elderly have really done well. I think it took longer, certainly, to maybe adopt new technologies that maybe people who are millennials are using on a daily basis. But I think over a few months, once that became the norm, a lot of the elderly population have been able to adopt those technologies and do well with them. Yeah.
And I want to talk too, I mean, obviously in this day and age, we talk a lot about mental health, mental illness, breaking the stigma. But for that generation, that wasn't something that was tossed around so much, right? Anxiety, depression, those kind of terms. It just, oh, you go to therapy, you know, those things, that's just not what they grew up with.
Well, they may not necessarily come up and say, I feel like I have anxiety or I feel like I have depression. Some may, of course. But others, you may detect it through other things, perhaps weight loss, some sense that they're not really participating as much in hobbies or things that they enjoyed in the past. You might notice a spouse might say somebody's more irritable, or a family member might mention that, and those are some signs that people may have some anxiety or depression. So using some of those tools can be helpful if people aren't able to name it themselves. Yeah.
I think too that it's related to their perception of that stigma, so they're not going to be using the terminology, but some of the words that you might hear are, I feel a little punk today, or I just feel a little low energy today. But it's based on what's normal for that person. If they have a particular kind of a lifestyle and suddenly there's a drastic change, then that's something to pay attention to. If it's just their norm and they're always feeling a little punk, then it's just their norm.
Right. And I guess what advice would you have for maybe, you know, children or caregivers in approaching those conversations if they're concerned, especially coming out of this past year, that maybe it is something a little more?
I think asking how they're feeling. Are they having any troubles or difficulties? And is there any way you can support them and help them? And then if you're still concerned, you know, asking, you know, could you participate and go with them just to a visit, to have two sets of ears listening to what the physician has to say, would be some of the starting points, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think just asking some questions. How are you doing? How are you feeling? But then breaking that down a little bit more. How you doing with eating? Are you feeling like you're getting enough to eat? Sometimes appetite changes when folks get older. Sometimes they have more of a sweet tooth because that just is kind of what appeals to them. So just asking those direct questions and being open to what you're hearing and not necessarily thinking anything beyond what you're hearing, not drawing conclusions. Unless it's something really significant, and then let's go talk to somebody.
Okay. So do they talk about their feelings and emotions over the past year? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, certainly. There's been a lot of discussion throughout the last year about how this pandemic's affected probably every single one of my patients. And some seem to kind of roll with the punches, you know, kind of go with the flow. And others have been really adversely affected in terms of really being bothered they haven't been able to spend time with family or do their normal activities. So again, very independent, or I guess very individualized, I would say. But some people have definitely expressed a lot of anxiety and stress, and then those you sort of have to have those discussions. Is this something that may get better? Maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and do we need to treat this or address this, or just kind of listen?
Right.
And so that's kind of how those visits go.
Yeah.
And I've heard everything from this is scary, or this is frustrating, and this makes me really mad, to, you know, just being sick of it and just, when is this going to be over? This is, you know, basically ridiculous. You know, I've lived this long, nothing's going to take me now, kind of a thing. So sometimes not fully understanding the impact can also be a good thing, because they're not necessarily internalizing it all.
And you both mentioned in the beginning that, you know, I think what a lot of people thought in terms of that this population was going to be impacted more severely when it comes to their, you know, mental, emotional well-being, that they've done pretty well. Why do you think that is?
Well, the studies that were published kind of towards the end of last year, 2020, seem to think that maybe it's just having wisdom, having life experiences prior to this, whether it was with different wars that have occurred or other hardships that they've individually dealt with in their lives, that they've been able to look at this as just one of those other instances and kind of put it in that kind of perspective, I think.
I think, folks that were born in the 30s and 40s, all the adversity that they faced, they had no choice but to just hunker down and do what they needed to do. And I think that this is just another example of what comes fairly naturally. And then maybe there's something going on inside that they're feeling uncomfortable, but they're doing what they believe they need to do to be safe and follow the rules and listen to the physicians, listen to the medical community. So they are very interested in listening to the authorities and how to conduct themselves and how to keep themselves safe.
I spent some time with Grace Farais, a resident at Cascade Trails Senior Living, who in her 90s maintains a spry and upbeat spirit, despite living through a difficult isolation period away from her family. Let's watch.
I knew that I had to have help, and assisted living, and I could say, well, I could stay home. I lived alone for 7 years. I could stay at home, but I knew that was not the right thing to. I needed the help that Cascade Trails had for me.
Obviously, you got here when everything was happening with the virus and with COVID. So talk to me a little bit about kind of what you were feeling during that time.
You always have the feeling of lonesomeness because I'm going to be in one room with myself. And normally I would have my family before the virus, that was. And I had a lot of activity. This was going to be different for me. And I had the help of the gals that were on the floor and were so loving and so kind. They could hug me and it gave me the feeling of just being cared for. They were going to care for me. And that's the way it turned out all of the time. I had such confidence in them and in the love for me. And I also had, of course, my family that were so helpful, along with the staff, and also all the help that I got, physically, mentally.
Talk about how important it is for you to be able to feel that connection and that you're cared for.
The love that they would have for me was sincere.
What was it like when you were able to see your family again and give them a hug again?
I loved it. I loved it. I had hope that I would be able to, and that was true. It was wonderful to see them in person rather than a telephone was wonderful.
So Syndi says you're the life of the party around here.
That's right. That's right.
And talk to me about that, your outlook on life and how you continue to live your life, you know?
I like being me.
Were you ever scared of the virus, or did you ever have any fear?
I didn't.
Okay.
I had the love that I have from my belief that the Lord would take care of me. And I had the hope that there will be a time when, once the vaccine, and that there was, I would be taken care of. And then the friends that I had in the building here at Cascade, the friends that I also made were a big help. I went through a time when I lost my sister 5 months ago. I wasn't able to go to the memorial, or of course because of the virus, and they all just seemed to surround me with love and with care. That was a great, great help.
After this past year and everything you've learned and everything you've gone through and everything with the virus, what would your message be? Or what do you want to tell people, especially maybe the younger generation?
I feel that family is very important. I came from a family of 8, 4 girls and 4 boys. Whether we didn't always have all the money that made it, but being together, which we were a lot most of the time, made a big difference. And as long as we were living, we enjoyed each other as a big family. But it's get to know one another, love one another, and it's not easy to raise a family, but it takes work. Doesn't necessarily mean you got to have a lot of money. That's not the part. But when we could see our, and I hadn't seen my little ones that were being born. I didn't see them for 9 months. Well, I got to see them on Easter Day and have dinner with them. And here was this little one that was a baby in a picture only. And I got to hold him. I got to see how a 2.5-year-old was still the same. and was so full of pep and energy that, but to see him and hold him, have him sit on my lap was a wonderful, wonderful thing.
It was such a pleasure to chat with Grace, such a sweet woman and a member of the silent generation of people born during the Great Depression who can really teach us so much. So do you think that isolation for a lot of them was maybe the hardest thing to overcome?
I think isolation certainly, and then the isolation because of the fear of COVID and how it could affect the elderly in terms of increased risk of death versus other populations or other age groups. I think those two kind of things going hand in hand, but I was the isolation and having to not be able to do the things they used to enjoy, whether it was traveling or seeing their family, and now being in the same place, for a year and not really being able to go anywhere and have any other outside contact. I think has been really hard.
Yeah, the change in routine, I think, was significant. Folks that live in a congregate setting, maybe used to doing things a particular way according to a calendar and not as self-directed, and suddenly they couldn't go out of their rooms, they couldn't go to exercise, they couldn't eat in dining rooms. And I think that was the frustrating part, along with not being able to see their family and hug the grandchild. And everybody likes the touch, and that's, I think, been something very significant.
That matters. Like, that's top 3 for them.
Yeah.
Is to physically see their family and their grandchildren
Yep.
and have that physical touch. And going off of that, that's why it was so important for the caregivers or coordinators who work in these living facilities to make sure that they were still providing the best way they could, because that was so important. And they had to work fast.
Yes.
To do that. So kind of put that into perspective, the pressure that they were under to make sure that worked. Because if it didn't, then you probably would start to see more of those cases
Yes.
of anxiety and depression.
Yeah, I think that what the industry has done, because they had to work so quickly, is to do some things in a non-traditional way. Doing bingo in a hallway, calling out bingo, and the residents are sitting in their doorway, doing hallway karaoke, arts and crafts in their hallway or in their doorway. And also I've heard examples of phone book clubs, having church services by phone, looking at creating that pattern and that expectant schedule, but doing it in unique ways so that they're still getting that social emotional benefit from talking with folks, interacting with folks. Maybe if they can't see, even though they might be able to see them, but they still are able to get those needs met.
Because that's how they thrive. I mean, if they do lose that, is that where you'd start to see those problems probably, right?
I think so. Certainly
Okay.
social interaction is really important.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had the opportunity to visit with Syndi Richmond, who manages the programming and activities at Cascade Trails Senior Living. Syndi explains the process and circumstances around altering their program and curriculum once they began to realize how extreme the situation was becoming and how they were as proactive as possible. Take a look.
It was hard for a lot of our residents in the beginning. Our original 6, that's what we call the original ones that were here, it was hard for them because they're all at different levels in their memory impairments, or they're totally cognitive, and they're like, well, I really want to see my daughter. I'm like, okay, well, you can sit at the window and visit with each other, and we provide you with a phone so you can talk to each other, but you can't, you can't touch, you can't hug, it was hard with the you can'ts for a lot of people. And then they didn't understand if they had a memory deficit. We have people with hearing impairments, and we wanted to make it comfortable for them, so we had to purchase furniture for our gazebo, so that way they could have a place to sit to visit with their families where it was quieter, because the construction out front could get loud during the day sometimes. So we just had to get really creative on how we were keeping our families unified.
And what was it like for you to watch those interactions, to have to remind them, okay, like you can see, your daughter today, but you can't touch them. That had to have been hard.
It's really heartbreaking to tell someone that they can't hug their daughter or their son, or in Grace's case, her dying sister. Like, just talking about it now makes me want to tear up a little bit, because who knows when she was going to get to see her again, when she was going to get to hug her again. And that was hard, because they were so close, and it was her younger sister. And, sometimes you have to bend those rules a little bit, because you still want them to have that connection with their family, and it might be like an air hug out here and not up here, but at least it's something, so that they can be together and see each other. But also, once we were able to start opening things back up, the family reunions were amazing, and I got to witness probably 90% of them, finally getting to hug each other because they got the rapid COVID test, so they can finally hug mom or dad. And it's really emotional to watch that as well.
Mm-hmm. And, talk a little bit about that. First, let's start with, those residents in the beginning. What signs or what things were you seeing in them when it came to their emotional and mental health?
In the beginning, emotionally, your family's here, they bring you here, they unpack your things, and then that's kind of it. That's all you see of them. And emotionally, they're kind of drained. Where's my daughter? Where's my son? When am I going home? Why can't they come? All the questions that we had to answer. And letting them know, too, that they're here so that we can keep them safe and keep them away from the virus, the best that we can. And okay, see you in 14 days through a window wasn't the same as, okay, see you in 14 days so I can hug you.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned like some emotional moments. I mean, were there times where, the resident said to you, I'm so lonely. I just, I feel so lost. Like,
I never heard I'm so lonely or lost. It was, I wish my family could come, but I'm glad that you guys are here to care for me. Strive to have a lot of fun activities for our residents, which kept them going and not being lonely and busy enough so that they knew that they missed their families and that they wished that they were here, but they also knew that there's always something to do that could occupy their time.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel more motivated than ever to make sure that you brought that to them?
Always, yeah. So one of our first big events was a camp out, and whole presentation on different national parks and what you could do when you went there and who's been there, and they just absolutely loved it. We did a Hawaii day. We've done so many fun things to keep them engaged during that time that they really weren't bored or lonely.
Right. And going back to when you mentioned about those reunions, could you see a change in them after they finally were able?
There's a lightness that comes with that, like, oh, I finally get to see my kids and make sure that they're okay. Talking on the phone to someone is one thing, but seeing them and being able to like lay eyes on them and touch them is totally different. And it just created a lighter atmosphere for the residents.
I feel like a lot of times their generation, it wasn't talked about, right? I mean, depression, anxiety, those kinds of things weren't things that they heard as much as we do now. Kind of talk about that a little bit, and maybe does that, create more obstacles in trying to identify, if they're struggling, or how you kind of work maybe through that?
So it is something that they don't talk about very often. But I don't know, when you're a stranger, sometimes they open up to you. One of the ladies is, everyone gets the winter blahs because it's winter. And especially this last winter with Christmas, we weren't really able to do a big indoor event for our residents to see their families, and again, had to think outside the box on what we were going to do there. So we ended up having our families come into our courtyard and do a big Christmas caroling with a guitar person to play along for our residents. And they were so happy and so excited that they at least got to see their families for Christmas when they still couldn't actually go out with them. Mm-hmm. So I try to make sure and look for signs of the residents being depressed or sad, and we talk about it and we try to turn it around and figure out something they can do to kind of pass the time.
I think it's so interesting to hear you say that, and I totally can understand that maybe, you know, if they're just sitting casually talking to you and they start to open up about things, and then maybe it kind of, they realize like, hey, that is now that kind of makes sense why I was feeling that way, you know?
Yes. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that they're here because they can't take care of themselves any longer. We, of course, want our residents here to stay independent as long as possible and do the things that they can do for themselves that they would want to do for themselves. And we just help out along the way. Not everyone here has dementia. You know, we do have a memory care unit, but not everyone here has memory deficits. This is a much different environment than a nursing home or a long-term care facility. You know, it's more for us about being a family for our residents and including them in that family so that they feel at home, at ease. You know, when you move in, we suggest that you bring your stuff from home because that's your stuff. That's what you're familiar with. And we decorate your apartment so that it looks like your home. You know, we want everyone to feel like they're home when they come here.
Mm-hmm. You know, what would you say was the biggest challenge when it comes mentally and emotionally to what your residents were experiencing? Was it the loneliness from the families? You mentioned, you know, that you don't think a lot of them were depressed. Can you pinpoint anything, or was it just the overall, you know, not being able to interact with their families?
Like I said, it's hard to sit at a window that's closed and communicate through a cell phone, which you probably don't understand how to use, pushing buttons, turning it off, calling them back. Like that's hard when it's not this generation's thing, you know, and we just don't have like a regular phone that you can sit there and talk through. So, you know, sitting there and just looking at your family through a screen, through a piece of glass is much harder than them sitting next to you, like even you and I are.
Could you sometimes feel or see that emptiness in them of how much they were like needing that? It's
not the same as me going home every night and hugging my children. You know, they no longer have that at that point. They did not have that, you know, and that's the kind of hug that they want, you know. All of our residents have been great in letting us emotionally support them with hugs and love and whatever we could give to them. But also, I'm not their child, you know, I'm not their grandchild. That's where things would get emotional, where I really miss my daughter. I wish I could just hug her. I want to lay eyes on her. I want to see her. I want to go shopping with her. When are things going to be normal again? Those are the answers we don't have.
Yeah. And for them, that means everything.
It does. And when you can't do your normal day-to-day life that you're used to, it gets frustrating because you want to be able to go out and do those things. You know, I have a lady who would love to go shopping. However, we can't because of the increase in the numbers. It's a very resilient generation. You know, what was going on during that time, and it's just amazing how that instilled so much in them and their resilience at this time.
Did any of them ever talk about, you know, fear over everything, or the fear of loss, you know, of people their age, you know, being that group that, you know, is most vulnerable? Did you ever have those kind of conversations?
It was more fear of loss of a family member. I feel like, you know, a few of our families in the beginning did have COVID, and they tried not to tell the residents, you know, oh, I'm just not feeling good today. That's why I can't come and drop this off to you. The residents are pretty smart. They figured it out pretty quick. You know, so it was more fear of like, am I going to lose my daughter? Am I going to lose my son? Am I going to lose my grandchildren to this? You know, and we had to be there to provide that reassurance. Like, it's going to be okay, and we're going to get through this. And if something does happen, we're going to be here for you.
Throughout the day we spent at Cascade Trails, it was obvious to see that Syndi plays a big role in the lives of those residents, and they truly do care for her. And I want to talk a little bit just about the dynamic when it comes to children and their parents now who are who they have to look out for a little more, I guess, if you will, and that dynamic. And I think what we've seen, and we saw that in our interviews at Cascade Trails too, that the children were maybe impacted a little more than the parents in the struggles, which you have to understand. I mean, I think about my own mom, if I was told I couldn't see her for this amount of time, I don't know when the next time is. By just looking at your mom if she's doing okay or how she likes things, and all of a sudden you don't have that control anymore, and that's really hard.
Right. I think it's been really difficult for families. They don't know what's going on necessarily in the facility. They haven't been able to go in up until recent weeks or months. Not knowing who else is infected in the area, not knowing if it's safe to even keep them in the residential facility, whether they should bring them out, but then there's the fears that go along with that as well. And just worrying about their parents' health has, I think, caused a lot of stress and anxiety in that age group, or that group of people too, certainly. Yeah.
I think adult children want to advocate for their loved ones, and if they get a sense that there's something not right, is it the responsibility of the organization where their loved one's staying, or is it some mystery kind of a rule that's come down from on high? And there's a lot of confusion about, wait a minute, I'm this daughter or I'm this son, I should be the one dictating. Who are you to tell me that I can't go and have a window visit? Or who are you to tell me these things? And there's been a big learning curve around that. And what adult children need to do to kind of bridge that understanding for their loved one too.
One of my interviews at Cascade Trails Senior Living last month included a family member of one of their residents who was kind enough to open up and share her experiences and the difficulties she had and her mom faced while navigating the complexities of quarantine. Let's watch.
Well, my mom is 93 years old and loves her Tigers, loves NCAA basketball, was crushed when they didn't have either last year, and was ecstatic this year when she got to watch the ball games. And this past July, she suffered some mini strokes that created a situation where she couldn't live on her own anymore. She needed a lot of extra help.
And all of that happened, her moving in here, during the middle of a pandemic.
Yes.
What was that like, for her and for you, not knowing how things are going to play out and the limitations that you might have?
We were in the pandemic when she suffered her stroke. So we already knew some of the limitations before she went to the hospital. The fact that was stressful because the family could not get in here to help her. We had to rely on the assistance here. And we're still doing that.
What was that like for you?
It's difficult. It was very difficult. Also, just like with a child, you can look at a child and see if they have a fever. Are they pulling on their ear so they may have an earache? Not being able to see my mom, to see, okay, does her hair need cut? Does she walk a little differently or hold herself a little differently? Does she look tired? You just can't see what might be ailing her, and you can't take care of it. You can hear her voice on the telephone. She sounds tired. She sounds agitated. Okay, what's causing that? You can talk to her about it, but you can't do anything about it. You can't go over there and say, let me fix this so you don't get aggravated because something's not in the right place or whatever. You have to just sit back and wait. And that's That's terribly hard.
So it affected you, I mean, mentally and emotionally too.
Sure. Sure, I'm in charge of her care when she's up here. That's my job. And I could only do parts of it. It was January of 2020 was the last time I actually saw her, other than in the hospital when she had her stroke.
That had to have been incredibly hard.
Yes. She kept saying, "When are you going to be able to come see me?" And you have to say, "I don't know." And you keep waiting, and as more directives come out, please make it so that I can go in and see her. And nothing until just very recently. And the day that happened, I called and I got my appointment set for Monday afternoon. And we knocked on her door and opened the door, and Syndi said, "Mrs. Dixon, you have a visitor." And I walked in there, and she looked around and she said, "Oh, you're here. You're finally here." And her voice is shaking, and I'm ready to cry, you know. And they allowed one hug. I mean, technically they probably shouldn't have done that, but too close, you know. And she just trembled. And that was the best day. For a while, if she went to a doctor's appointment, even though it wasn't something bad medical, it was her eyes and things like that, she would have to quarantine for 14 days afterwards. That meant eating all of her meals in her room, no activities, even if they were able to have them within the facility, which for a long time they couldn't. The only people she saw were the staff, and that's bringing meals in, getting her laundry, making her bed, routine things like that. She mentioned a couple times that the staff would just sit and talk to her for a while, you know, and that's the only outside contact she had. For 14 days in this apartment with no outside contact, basically, or anything else to do.
You know, was she struggling with that?
Sure. Sure. And that's usually when she would ask, "When are you going to be able to come in?" Or she'd say, "When you're finally able to come in." She knew there wasn't a choice. You have to stay in your apartment. You have to do this or that, or when they could finally come out. That was a relief, you know, and yet the other day, I'm in her apartment. We're really not supposed to touch, and we obey the rules. So, you know, you want to do something differently, but she'll say, "We can't touch," but okay.
Yeah.
Well, anytime they tell us we can touch, there's a hug involved. But she has put up with the restrictions. She knows that they're not doing it to harm her, but it's the only way that we're going to get past it. And I think she's probably dealt with it better than I have. I have wanted to rant and rave at times, and there's not a thing I can do about it. Just try to keep both of us calm, I guess, but...
Do you now realize just how important that, you know, that physical connection is, of being able to hug and physically see each other and be there? Has that changed your perspective and how that just impacts so many things in our life and our mental and emotional well-being?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid if we're not careful, it will be taken away again. And once you get a taste of it, it's hard to give it up.
A truly telling relationship and symbolic of what many of you have gone through with your own parents. And it's worth mentioning that Beverly's mother, Anona, was originally scheduled to actually interview with me for this episode, but the day prior we were notified that she was just feeling a great deal of anxiety about the conversation and wanted to watch the interviews instead, which is of course understandable. It's notable that the expectation she was feeling with the cameras and the lights, it was affecting her mental health. And what would be, I guess, some of your best advice in approaching that kind of situation, you know?
That's the key, is kind of letting them still be their own person and maybe asking and trying to probe a little bit and see how they're doing, but rather than just making assumptions about how they're doing and thinking this is how they must be feeling based on the fact that all this is going on, and really asking how that's impacting them and trying to get a sense of that, and then going from there. If things seem good and you're not seeing any kind of concerning signs or symptoms, letting them continue to do what they're doing, right? And then if there are some concerning issues with weight loss or seeming like they're less interested, maybe more despondent, getting more involved and working with them with their primary care doctor if they'll allow that. Yeah.
I think that that's been one of the learnings out of this, is just to take that time to listen and not impose, but to ask those questions. And then if you're feeling a particular way, like, Dad, I'm really scared right now. I haven't been vaccinated. I don't know what to do. I feel vulnerable when I come to visit you, in owning it, but instead of saying, things real directly and real kind of in a control-like way, just having a conversation.
And I know we've touched on this in previous conversations too, about the terms, when it comes to anxiety and depression, and how they don't necessarily want to be labeled. I mean, no one wants to be labeled, right? But especially coming from a generation where those aren't words that they necessarily grew up hearing.
Right.
So if you bring this conversation maybe to your mom or your grandma, they're going to be like, what? I don't have depression, you know?
So I think using some of those questions like, are you doing the same things you used to do? Are you enjoying them as much? What are you participating these days? And seeing if they're kind of seem to be, a little bit more regressing in terms of their social interactions. I mean, I know they're limited now during this time, but still you can kind of get a sense of their interest level and whether they're just watching TV all day and those sorts of things. And maybe looking at that or seeing if they constantly are kind of worried about things, and just say, maybe use worry versus anxiety as a word. It seems to be more accepted, and again, just trying to get them to express how they're feeling without using, without labeling things isn't really the important part, but the important part is to sort of see how they're feeling.
Let's talk a little bit too about just the importance of the fact that, we're finding that they're so resilient, right? We've always known that. And taking the time to truly listen to what they have to say and not take for granted.
Life view of this experience is very helpful in terms of being able to handle it yourself, because this might be one of the newer adverse events you've had to deal with, and so seeing how they're going through it can be very helpful.
When we think about, kind of on the humorous side, the stories that we've heard about, yes, I walked up the hill in snow with no shoes on and back, and poor me. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but if we do listen to their stories, there's not only lessons to be learned, but there's linkages there, really powerful things for us to appreciate and understand. Hey, this is how my family developed. Now I understand this trait or this or that, but being able to listen and to take those times to appreciate and value. And I think that that's a piece of this is all of us have had to develop connections in a unique way this past year and a half.
Yeah, I see a lot of hope right now in my practice in terms of the vaccines coming out, and a lot of my elderly patients have been vaccinated now, which makes them feel a lot more comfortable leaving, and also that they're not going to infect other people or their other family members, young children who may not have been vaccinated yet, and it gives them a real sense of safety that they can do that, and so I think now there is a sort of light at the end of the tunnel, and that life may be able to get closer to normal or the way it used to be. Yeah.
With those differences in perspective and opinion can also be kind of like the areas of our community where maybe that confidence isn't there, but those decisions that others may make may still affect us. And how do we begin to bridge those differences and that understanding about either being unwilling to get the vaccine or maybe being suspicious about a variety of things. I think people that have been around the block a few times have experienced that suspicion and have kind of walked through it in a variety of ways, whereas maybe the younger people are stuck on those theories, and because that's the first time they've ever experienced thinking about things in a negative way like that, like, oh my goodness, I am mortal. Oh my goodness, there's this bug that suddenly is coming out of nowhere.
Anything else you just want to add about, you guys obviously, work with the elderly population on a daily basis, and just over this past year, just what you really want people to know about, who they are sometimes. I feel like sometimes it can just be such a misconception of what they're capable of, and now they've kind of proved themselves again this past year.
That's right. Yeah. Don't write the elderly off. That's for sure. They have a lot. They have a lot of wisdom to kind of impart to us, but they're also able to make their own decisions, and many of them, and certainly those that can't, need the assistance of others, but to respect their views and listen to them and just really ask them what they're looking for and what they need, I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think it's what we've been talking about is include people with all differences, because it's nothing magical happens when you turn 55. It's just part of the process of living, and being 55, 65, 70, it's just part of development. We're always developing until we're no longer developing, but it's part of the natural cycle of things. And other cultures fully embrace the elderly, and they live as multi-generational households. It's very powerful. In the U.S., that might not happen as frequently, but respecting and understanding those connections, I think, are huge, whether it be because of the pandemic or because of something else that's popped up. This isn't the end of something dramatic happening. This is just the right now example.
It's made people realize, it's like one of those things, like once you have something, like once it's gone, you realize, how you want it back, how you're so thankful for that. And I think it's made people realize to not take advantage of the time, of the conversation, of the being able to help and listen to that generation.